Notice what you do when something goes well. A small win at work. A pleasant conversation. A morning where the gratitude practice actually felt like something. You take a moment internally to acknowledge it. You feel the lift. You make a mental note. See, the practice is working. The mood follows the effort. The technique is doing what the technique was supposed to do. Now notice what happens 3 days later when something goes seriously wrong. A diagnosis. A betrayal. A failure that cannot be reframed away. The gratitude practice, when you reach for it now, feels thin, almost insulting, as if you are being asked to be grateful while the actual condition of your life is on fire. The optimism that felt natural 3 days ago feels, suddenly, like a performance. And the affirmations quietly accumulating in your journal are revealed for what they are. Tools that work in good weather, with very little to offer when the weather changes. This is the moment that almost no one warns you about when you begin a positive psychology practice. The tools are real. The research is real. The benefits, in good conditions, are measurable and worth pursuing. But the moment the conditions stop cooperating, and they always eventually do, many of these tools quietly stop working, and the practitioner is left with a question they did not know they needed to ask. What was I actually standing on? The Stoics asked this question 2,000 years ago, in conditions that made it urgent rather than theoretical. They lived through plagues, exile, the executions of friends. They were not opposed to positive emotion. They valued joy, friendship, the quiet pleasures of a well-lived day. What they were opposed to was confusing the upper floors of psychological life with its foundation. And they were unusually precise about the difference. 3 things separate a well-being practice that is built on foundation from one that is built on weather. Understanding those 3 things, taken seriously, changes how a person designs their inner life. Welcome to Logostoic. What you are about to hear is not a critique of positive psychology. The research is real, the tools are useful, and there is no reason to abandon them. This video is about something prior, about what those tools rest on, and what happens when the ground beneath them is not what you thought it was. This is not for the person who wants to be told their current practice is fine. It is for the person who is willing to ask whether what works in good conditions is the same as what works in all conditions, and who is ready to start building the second kind. If that is you, like this video, subscribe to Logostoic, and stay for every part of what comes next. Each of the 3 points builds on the previous one. If you are ready to look at the foundation rather than the furniture, prove you're ready to look down. Comment now. I check my foundation. Now let's begin. Seneca wrote a short treatise that has come down to us under the title De Tranquillitate Animi, on the tranquility of mind. It was addressed to his friend Serenus, who had written to Seneca describing a particular kind of psychological distress that almost any modern reader will recognize immediately. Serenus was not depressed exactly. He was not in crisis. He was successful by every external measure and was practicing philosophy seriously. But he reported a persistent low-grade unsettledness, a sense that his interior life kept oscillating, that calm came and went without his choosing, that the moment he stopped actively producing it, it began to slip. Seneca's response, written nearly 2,000 years before the founding of positive psychology as a discipline, identifies the exact phenomenon that the modern science has been grappling with under the names hedonic adaptation, set point theory, and emotional return to baseline. Serenus, Seneca recognized, was caught in a cycle that no amount of effort within the cycle could break. He was producing positive emotional states. The states were genuine, and they were also, by their nature, temporary, and the temporariness was leaving Serenus in a perpetual condition of needing to produce the next state in order to feel that his life was working. The Greek word Seneca offered as the alternative was Euthumia. The translation is difficult. It is sometimes rendered as tranquility, sometimes as serenity, sometimes as cheerfulness, and none of these quite captures what Seneca meant. Euthumia is not a feeling that comes and goes. It is a settled, stable interior orientation, a kind of psychological architecture that holds independently of what the emotional weather happens to be doing on any given day. The person with Euthumia is not a person who always feels good. They are a person whose sense of being all right in their own life does not depend on whether they currently feel good or not. This is a different target than the one most positive psychology practices set. The modern science, in its dominant forms, is largely organized around increasing positive effect, generating more of the emotions associated with flourishing. Gratitude practices, optimism training, strength-based interventions, mindfulness deployed as a mood regulation tool. All of these work by cultivating the positive side of the emotional ledger. The underlying logic is intuitive and empirically supported. Increase the frequency and intensity of positive emotional states, and overall well-being rises. The research confirms this in study after study, and there is no honest reason to dispute it. But the research has also more quietly confirmed something else, something that the Stoics named 2,000 years before the data existed. The positive states that these practices generate are subject to the same adaptation as everything else in human emotional life. They fade. They require renewal. The person who has structured their well-being around the continuous production of positive effect is, without quite recognizing it, on a treadmill that requires increasing effort to maintain the same standing. And when life delivers conditions that interrupt the production of positive effect, illness, loss, sustained stress, the kind of difficulty that no reframing technique can dissolve, the practitioner discovers that what they were standing on was the effect itself. Take away the effect, and there is nothing underneath. This is not a hypothetical scenario for the people who have lived through it. It is the predictable arc of any practice that has built only what produces positive feeling, without building what holds when positive feeling is unavailable. The gratitude journal that helped for 2 years stops helping in the 3rd year, when the loss has accumulated past the point where the prompts can dissolve it. The optimism that carried the early phase of a career fails in the late phase, when the optimism collides with conditions that no positive framing will alter. The strengths-based identity built in good conditions becomes a source of additional pain in conditions that prevent the strengths from being deployed. None of this is a failure of the original practice. It is a failure of the practice to include what was needed for the situation it eventually faced. Euthumia is precisely the underneath. It is what holds when the effect is not available. Seneca described it as the condition of a person who has stopped being at war with their own life, who has, through the disciplined examination of their values and their relationship to external things, arrived at a kind of peace that does not require the world to cooperate in order to hold. The peace is not produced by the conditions. It is brought to the conditions. And the difference between those two arrangements, peace produced by conditions versus peace brought to them, is the difference between a well-being that is fragile and one that is durable. A well-being produced by conditions ends when the conditions end. A well-being brought to the conditions holds even when nothing in the conditions is supporting it. The first kind is a transaction. The second kind is a possession. Only the second kind is genuinely yours. There is a distinction worth drawing here that the Greek philosophical tradition handled with unusual precision. Aristotle, writing several centuries before Seneca, used a different word for the goal of a well-lived life, eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing. Eudaimonia is closer to what modern positive psychology means by well-being, a comprehensive condition of human thriving that includes external goods, relationships, the exercise of one's capacities. It is a worthwhile target, and the Stoics did not entirely reject it, but they observed that eudaimonia, defined this comprehensively, is partially dependent on circumstances that no person fully controls. You can be doing everything right, and a disease can intervene. You can have built a life of meaningful relationships, and they can be taken from you. Eudaimonia, in its full Aristotelian sense, is vulnerable in ways that nothing the practitioner does can fully address. Euthumia is the Stoic narrowing of the target. It is what you can have regardless. It is the psychological condition that remains available to a person who has lost almost everything that makes eudaimonia possible. The Stoics did not consider this a downgrade. They considered it a clarification. They argued that the only kind of well-being worth organizing your life around is the kind that cannot be taken, because any other kind, by its nature, will eventually be taken, and a life organized around something that can be taken is a life organized around its own future collapse. The practical implication for a modern positive psychology practice is not that you should stop pursuing positive states. The states are real, the research is solid, and there is no reason to refuse what they offer. The implication is that the positive states should not be confused with the foundation underneath them. Treat the gratitude practice as a useful exercise. Treat the optimism training as a calibration tool. But do not mistake either of them for the thing that is going to hold you when the conditions that make them easy stop cooperating. Something else has to be built for that. Something quieter, more demanding, and considerably more durable. The Stoics spent their lives building it, and the literature they left behind is one of the most detailed manuals for that work that any civilization has produced. It is not a complete replacement for modern positive psychology. It is what the modern science is missing. You have been measuring your well-being by how good you feel. The good feeling is the weather, not the ground. Stop trusting the mood to tell you the truth about your life. Comment below, I am not my good moods. In the year 524, a Roman philosopher and statesman named Boethius found himself in a prison cell awaiting execution. He had been one of the most powerful and accomplished men in the post-Roman West, a consul, a magister officiorum at the court of the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, a translator of Aristotle and Plato into Latin, the author of mathematical and theological treatises that would shape European thought for the next 1,000 years. He had a wife he loved, sons whose careers he had launched, a reputation that placed him at the intellectual center of his age. And then, almost overnight, he was accused of treason on charges he maintained were false, stripped of everything, and confined to await an execution that came, eventually, with deliberate brutality. Most people, faced with conditions this extreme, would have collapsed. Boethius did something else. He wrote. The text he produced in that cell, The Consolation of Philosophy, is one of the most remarkable philosophical documents in the Western tradition, a sustained dialogue between Boethius and a figure he calls Lady Philosophy, in which he works through systematically and with genuine rigor. The question of where genuine well-being actually resides when everything that ordinarily constitutes a person's reasons for being well has been removed. What is striking about the consolation is not that Boethius found comfort in his cell. It is that he found something more rigorous than comfort. He worked out, in argument after careful argument, the conclusion that the Stoics had been pointing at for centuries, that the goods which can be taken are not the goods on which a stable life can be built. Not because they are not real goods, they are. A reputation, a family, a body of work, the love of one's friends, these are real and worth caring about. But any well-being that depends on their continued presence is always one event away from collapse. The floor drops, and everything built on it drops with it. This is what I want to call the Boethius test, because it is the test that almost no well-being practice actually faces under good conditions, and that almost every well-being practice will eventually face under conditions that no one chooses. The test is simple in form and unforgiving in execution. When everything that normally generates your sense of being well has been removed, what is left? Not theoretically. Actually. What does your psychological life look like when the inputs your practice depends on are no longer arriving? If the answer is nothing, if removing the favorable conditions removes the sense of being all right, then what you have built is not a foundation. It is a transmission. Your interior state is being broadcast from the outside in, and your practice is the receiver that picks up the signal. Block the signal, and there is nothing. This is not a defect in you. It is the structure of any well-being practice that has not deliberately built the underneath. Most modern positive psychology, even at its most evidence-based and well-intentioned, does not focus on building the underneath. It focuses on improving the reception of the signal. And as long as the signal is coming through, the practice works. Boethius' cell was the loss of the signal. And what he found in the writing was that there was something else available to him, something the conditions had not removed and could not remove. He called it, in different passages, the goods of the mind, the goods that depend only on the soul, the inheritance of philosophy. The Stoics had been pointing at the same thing under different names. Marcus Aurelius called it the inner citadel, the part of the self that is not at the mercy of what arrives from outside, because it is not dependent on outside conditions to maintain its integrity. Epictetus called it the prohairesis, the moral will, the only territory that is genuinely and inalienably the practitioner's own. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions of a specific psychological structure that the Stoics believed could be built, through practice, through examination, through the daily, unromantic work of separating what is yours from what is not, and locating your stability in the former rather than the latter. The structure is not visible to a person who has never had reason to need it. It is also not buildable in the moment of crisis. By the time the crisis arrives, either the structure has been built or it has not. The Stoics were unusually direct about this. The inner citadel is constructed in peacetime. In wartime, it is occupied or it is not. James Stockdale, the American naval officer who spent 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, credited his survival to the Stoic philosophy he had studied in graduate school years before his capture. He said, in interviews afterward, that the Epictetus he had read in seminars at Stanford had given him without him knowing it at the time, the precise psychological tools he needed in the conditions that came later. He had not been studying philosophy to survive a prison cell. He had been studying it because the questions interested him. But the work he had done in good conditions was what was available to him when the conditions changed beyond recognition. The structure had been built, and when it was needed, it was there. Modern research has, in a more empirical register, confirmed what Boethius and the Stoics were describing. The psychologist George Bonanno's work on resilience, the systematic study of how people respond to extreme adversity, has produced one of the more counterintuitive findings in the field. Most people exposed to severe loss and trauma do not experience the prolonged collapse that classical models predicted. They suffer, often deeply, but they also retain a substantial capacity to continue functioning, to find meaning, to maintain core relationships. And what predicts this capacity is not, as a popular reading might suggest, baseline happiness or positive affect or even social support. It is something closer to what the Stoics meant by inner citadel, a stable internal reference point, a clear sense of one's own values, the practiced ability to act in accordance with those values even when conditions are not cooperating. The people who emerge from extended adversity with their integrity intact tend to share a particular profile. They are not the people who were happiest before the adversity arrived. They are the people who had, often without naming it as such, done the inner work that the Stoics describe. They had thought seriously about their values. They had located their sense of themselves in something other than the conditions of their lives. They had built, through years of small and unromantic choices, a structure that the adversity could not reach. When the storm came, the structure held, not because the storm was small, but because the structure had been built for storms. This is what positive psychology, in its most popular forms, has had difficulty addressing. It is genuinely useful for improving daily life in conditions that are basically supportive. It is less useful, sometimes considerably less useful, for the conditions that the Boethius test actually presents. And the practitioner who has not noticed this distinction may build, over years, a practice that performs beautifully in good weather and discovers, only when the weather changes, that it never had the structure to hold in any other kind. The crisis is coming, and it will not warn you. By the time it arrives, the foundation is either built or it is not. Check it now, not later. Type below, I look before I need to. The Stoic contribution to a modern well-being practice is not a replacement of positive psychology. It is the architectural layer beneath it, the foundation that makes the upper floors actually livable rather than merely decorated. Understanding the relationship between the two is what makes both genuinely useful, rather than turning either into a competitor of the other. Think of it this way. Positive psychology, at its best, builds the upper floors of a psychological life. It cultivates the experiences and orientations that make ordinary days more vivid, more connected, more meaningful. Gratitude practices restore visibility to what has faded into background. Strength-based interventions allow a person to deploy what they are actually good at in environments that reward it. Optimism, properly calibrated, helps a person stay in the work long enough to see results. Mindfulness, used as a regulation tool, reduces the cost of difficult emotional content. These are real. They are worth doing, and they will give you, in good conditions, a substantially better life than you would have without them. The Stoic foundation, by contrast, does not produce these vivid daily experiences. It produces something quieter, the stability that the upper floors are sitting on. The practices that build it are not the ones that come with immediate visible rewards. The disciplined examination of your values. The daily separation of what is within your control from what is not. The honest evening review of where you fell short of your own standards. The voluntary engagement with discomfort. The practiced ability to hold an impression without immediately endorsing it. These do not feel like progress in the way that a gratitude practice can feel like progress. They feel, for a long time, like nothing, and then, at the moment when nothing else is working, they feel like the only thing that is. What modern positive psychology, in its dominant forms, has tended to miss is precisely this distinction. The framework treats well-being as a single thing, a level of flourishing that can be raised through intervention. The Stoics treated it as a layered structure in which the upper layers were vulnerable in ways that the lower layers were not, and in which the work required at each level was fundamentally different. Building the upper layers without the foundation produces a practice that works beautifully in good weather and fails predictably in everything else. Building the foundation without the upper layers produces a life that is stable but austere, not what the Stoics actually recommended, despite the common misreading. They wanted both. They wanted joy, and they wanted the kind of joy that does not require the world to cooperate. They wanted gratitude, and the kind of stability that holds when there is nothing immediately to be grateful for. The integrated practice, and this is what the most thoughtful contemporary teachers in both traditions are now beginning to describe, combines them deliberately. You keep the gratitude practice, because gratitude is real and the practice works. But you do not mistake it for the foundation. Underneath the gratitude practice, you do the work of building the inner citadel, the disciplined daily examination, the cultivation of equanimity, the practiced separation between yourself and your circumstances. The foundation does not replace the gratitude. It supports it, and when the conditions that make gratitude easy stop cooperating, what remains is not nothing. It is the foundation, doing exactly the work it was built for. There is a precise example worth giving here. The Stoic practice that comes closest to what positive psychology calls gratitude is something they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of difficulties. It sounds at first like the opposite of gratitude. The practitioner deliberately imagines losing what they have, not as morbid fantasy, but as a calibrated exercise. And what emerges from the practice is, paradoxically, exactly the experience that gratitude practices aim at producing. Having briefly imagined the absence of something, you return to its presence with renewed attention. The thing that had faded into background becomes vivid again. The mind, freed from its assumption of permanence, registers what it has. The same emotional result as gratitude, arrived at through a fundamentally different mechanism, and crucially, through a mechanism that does not depend on conditions remaining favorable, because the mechanism is the deliberate engagement with their possible loss. This is gratitude with a foundation underneath it. The positive emotion is real, but it is built on something more durable than the assumption that the conditions will continue. It is built on the disciplined awareness that the conditions will not continue, that this particular configuration of goods is temporary, that the appropriate response to a good that is temporary is not anxiety about its loss but attention to its presence. The Stoic version of gratitude does not require the conditions to remain favorable. It is, if anything, sharpest in the moments when the loss is imminent, because the foundation has already done the work of integrating impermanence rather than pretending it does not apply. The mind that has stopped pretending is the mind that can finally see what is actually here. This is what the integrated practice looks like across every domain. Positive psychology's optimism, calibrated by the Stoic discipline of distinguishing what is within and outside one's control. Strength-based interventions, anchored by the Stoic insistence that the deepest strength is the capacity to act well regardless of strength. Mindfulness as mood regulation, deepened by the Stoic practice of using mindfulness to examine and refuse the impressions that the mind produces automatically. In every case, the upper floor and the foundation work together. Remove either, and the structure becomes either fragile or unlivable. Build both, and you have a well-being practice that does not stop working when the weather changes. The practical question for anyone reading this is not which of the two traditions to commit to. It is which layer of your existing practice is currently underdeveloped. Most people in modern conditions have built considerably more of the upper floor than the foundation. They have a gratitude practice, perhaps a meditation app, an established daily routine of mood-supportive habits. What they often have less of is the deeper work, the disciplined separation of self from circumstances, the daily review of how their values held under pressure, the deliberate cultivation of the part of the mind that watches the emotional, whether rather than being moved by every change in it. That deeper work is what needs to be added, not in place of the existing practice, but underneath it. The gratitude practice becomes more durable when it is sitting on the inner citadel rather than on the assumption that gratitude will continue to be easy to access. The optimism becomes more honest when it is calibrated by the dichotomy of control rather than by the assumption that the future will cooperate with effort. The mindfulness becomes more useful when it is being deployed by the governing faculty rather than functioning as another input to be passively received. In every case, the same upper floor practice does more work because something has been built underneath it that was not there before. You have been decorating the upper floor and ignoring the ground it stands on. Stop decorating. Build the ground beneath it. Write in the comments, I build both layers. Positive psychology is not wrong. It is incomplete, in the specific sense that a house is incomplete without a foundation. The upper floors can be beautifully furnished and genuinely pleasant to live in, and they are. But when the ground shifts, you discover what was holding them up. The Stoic question is not whether you feel good. It is whether the ground beneath your psychological life is solid enough to hold when feeling good is not available. Seneca's Euthumia, Marcus' Inner Citadel, Boethius writing in a cell, the contemporary research on resilience that confirms what they were describing. These are not decorations of a well-furnished life. They are the foundation. And a positive psychology practice that does not reach down to that level is, however effective in good conditions, one serious difficulty away from showing you exactly where it ends. The work of building the foundation is not as visible as the work of building the upper floors. It does not produce the immediate rewards that a gratitude journal produces. It does not announce itself in measurable mood improvements within the first week. It accumulates slowly, in the kind of daily, unromantic discipline that the Stoics practiced, and that very little modern self-improvement content actually recommends. But what it produces, over time, is a well-being that is not subject to revocation by circumstance, and that, the Stoics believed, is the only kind of well-being that is worth the effort of pursuing in the first place. Everything else is rented from the conditions, and the conditions eventually ask for it back. The choice is not between positive psychology and Stoicism. The choice is between a well-being practice that has only upper floors and one that has both upper floors and the foundation underneath them. The second kind is what the Stoics built, refined over centuries, and left for anyone willing to study what they actually did. It is, 2,000 years later, still available to anyone willing to do the work, in any language, in any culture, under any conditions, because what it was built for has not changed. The choice is not between positive psychology and Stoicism. It is between a practice with only upper floors and one with both upper floors and the foundation underneath. That is the real conclusion of today's video. And it changes, if you take it seriously, not what you do but what you understand you're doing to be doing. The gratitude practice continues. The optimism training continues. But what they sit on becomes something you can also work on, deliberately, every day. If something in today's video raised a question about your own practice that you had not yet thought to ask, consider liking this video. Because honest questions about the foundation of our psychological lives deserve to reach the people who are ready to look there. A lot of positive psychology content rewards reassurance. This kind of question rewards examination. Every like helps it find the people who can use it. And leave a comment. Write down one aspect of your current well-being practice that depends heavily on favorable conditions, and ask honestly what it offers when those conditions are removed. The Stoics believe that question is not depressing. It is clarifying. The stability you are looking for begins with knowing what you are actually standing on. Naming the gap is the first step toward closing it. The next person reading the comments will be doing the same work, and your honest naming will help theirs. Subscribe to Logostoic, because the work of building a foundation beneath your well-being practice is not completed in a single conversation. It is built gradually, through the kind of thinking this channel is dedicated to. The questions are worth returning to. The practices are worth deepening. And the difference, over years, between a well-being that holds and one that does not is built one careful inquiry at a time. We will keep going together. May you build well, not only on what feels good in favorable conditions, but on what genuinely holds when feeling good is not available.